Our guest today is Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges. He's the former commanding general of the U.S. Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. He's affiliated with the New Strategy Center in Bucharest, the Warsaw Security Forum in Warsaw, and GlobeSec in Prague. Furthermore, he serves on several civic advocacy advisory boards, consults for several companies on Europe, NATO, the European Union, and many other topics. He is the co-author of the book Future War and the Defense of Europe, published by Oxford University Press. General Hodges has a very regular presence on U.S. and international media. He offers insight and analysis on NATO, U.S. and European security, the Russian war against Ukraine, Greater Black Sea and Baltic Sea regions, the Israel-Hamas war, Trump administration policies, and their implications for transatlantic security, among other topics. He is a native of Quincy, Florida. He graduated from the United States Military Academy in May 1980 and was commissioned as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army. After his assignment as lieutenant in Germany, he commanded infantry units at the company, battalion, and brigade levels in the 101st Airborne, including the 1st Brigade Combat Team, known as Bastogne, in Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003 to 2004. He held a long list of impressive positions over the ensuing decade, culminating in his last military assignment as Commanding General, U.S. Army Europe, from 2014 to 2017. He retired from the U.S. Army in January 2018 and lives today with his wife, Dr. Alexandra Schwarzkopf, in Frankfurt, Germany. His talk today will be an analysis of the current geostrategic situation and crises around the world and a recommendation for how to look at these parts of a strategic whole versus as a set of different disconnected trouble spots. He will provide recommendations for addressing this situation, which will include diplomatic and economic components, as well as all facets of the military situation, including alliances and the relationship with the defense industry. With that, General Hodges, thank you.
Okay, Michael, thank you, and to the Mackinder Forum for this privilege, and thanks to all of you guys for coming out today to listen and participate. I want to make it worth your while, and I owe you the courtesy of being direct and candid in giving my assessments. I plan to use about the first 30 minutes to put some things on the table, and then reserving the majority of the time to address questions or challenges or pushback on any of those things. I always benefit, frankly, more from that than listening to myself. Now, the title, Organizing for Victory, is something that I had started thinking about, frankly, a couple of years ago, because I was so frustrated that the United States and others were failing to figure out how to help Ukraine defeat Russia. And there was just a stream of excuses of why we couldn't do it. It was too expensive. We didn't have the ability. The countries couldn't produce what was needed. There was no way that Ukraine could win anyway. So obviously the world has moved on since over the last 2 years, and we're in a significantly different place right now than we were, even 1 year ago. But I think the idea of organizing for victory is still valid. And of course, what I'm talking about is looking at the different conflicts that are out there now, and I won't go through all of them, but the most obvious, Ukraine and Russia, Iran, the United States, Israel, and the Iranian proxies. China is out there, and then, of course, North Korea growing its nuclear capabilities. So those are the main sort of conflicts that I see as being interconnected, and we ought to approach them that way. Now, one of the kind of questions that I want to put out right away and that we can talk about is a question that I get all the time, because people are concerned about what is the United States doing? What, under the Trump administration, what does that mean for NATO? U.S. presence in Europe is probably going to be decreasing based on the announcement the other day. and based on the national security strategy that the administration published back in the fall. So the question, understandably, comes up a lot. Can Europe defend itself? I would say yes, but we'll unpack that maybe as we go along. So if you go back to 1941, December 1941, Great Britain is alone against Nazi Germany. The Germans had conquered almost all of Europe. They were knocking at the door of Moscow and Leningrad, and it was not a time for great optimism. The United States had clung to its isolationist tendencies. We had an army that was number 17 in the world, right behind Bulgaria. We were not prepared for war. No American wanted to go to Europe to fight in another war. Most of the Americans were first, second, and third generation European immigrants, and they said, "That's hell, I just left that place. I don't want to go back to get involved in a war." And so there was not appetite in America in December 1941. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor happens. And then after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Now, in late December of 1941, Roosevelt had invited Winston Churchill to come to Washington to spend Christmas at the White House. And then in January, the next month, the following weeks actually, the U.S. and Great Britain conducted what was called the Arcadia Conference. And this was the beginning of the strategic thinking and of the Allies organizing for victory, although in January 1942, there was, of course, no reason or no expectation for optimism. We were in a terrible place, and it looked like both Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan were on the march. And so these both sides met here in the Arcadia Conference in Washington, and of course they figured out who had what and who was going to do what. But the most important thing that came out of the Arcadia Conference was a decision of Germany first. You had to defeat Nazi Germany first before trying to defeat the Empire of Japan. Now, this is significant because it was completely counter to what most Americans wanted to do. Most Americans were not interested in going back to Europe. The Japanese had just launched a major surprise attack and destroyed most of the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. And yet, Churchill and Roosevelt knew that if we were ever going to win this war, you had to defeat Germany first, because we could not afford to lose Great Britain. We'd need it for invasion of Europe. The resources of the British Empire were part of this as well. And so that was an important strategic decision that was made, Germany first. And then the key thing that happened, of course, was Roosevelt could then turn to the American people and explain why Germany first. A year later, January 1943, was the Casablanca Conference in North Africa. Once again, Churchill and Roosevelt meet. January 1943, not a lot of reason for optimism. The war was still going poorly for the Allies, but now these two leaders decided not only are we going to stick with Germany first, but we have an end state, which is unconditional surrender. That was the strategic objective, unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. Not we're going to try and get Hitler to a better negotiating position or strengthen our negotiating position, unconditional surrender. Why does that matter? If you're going to organize for victory, then you have to have a clearly defined objective. You have to get industry to make the necessary conversions. You have to change laws that would enable us to do what needed to be done to accomplish this strategic objective of unconditional surrender of the enemy. And you had to get public support. Remember, I said that the U.S. Army was like number 17 or 18 in the world, right behind Bulgaria. at the end of 1941. By the end of 1945, we had 12 million women and men in uniform in the Army and the Navy. And Great Britain continued to grow its capabilities. And then this is how we eventually were able to defeat Germany and Japan, and of course, Italy. So, what's the point of this historical framework up front? The clarity of an end state, and then the ability of leaders to explain to their populations, to talk to their populations as if they're adults and explain what is at stake. And then to get the Congress, in the case of the United States, the Congress had to change laws that would enable industry to make the necessary changes, to prioritize resources. And many of these laws are still in effect today in the United States. But it took the president working with the Congress to be able to organize like this. And then, of course, to explain to the American people. And as I look at some of you, many of you are old enough to remember, probably your parents were kids during the war. Certainly, I can remember my parents talking about victory gardens and metal drives and things like that, that probably did not contribute materially to the war, but it got every family involved in the war. Everybody felt they had a stake in it. And this was the importance of the strategic leadership of President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill at the time. So I put that up front because this is what's missing. This is what's missing today. It was missing during the Biden administration on the U.S. side, and it's certainly missing during the Trump administration right now. A lack of clarity, an unwillingness even to state what is our strategic objective when it comes to Ukraine. Most of the conversation about Ukraine during the last administration was couched in terms of as if it was charity, as opposed to being something that's important not only for Europe, but also for America's strategic interests. And so you did not have that clarity of end state, and so then the narrative got caught up in American domestic politics, and we never did deliver to Ukraine what they needed when they could have actually knocked Russia out of the war probably 2 years ago. Instead, we've missed that. We've missed that opportunity. And now, of course, the current administration has no interest in helping Ukraine, and it's the opposite. They seem to support the Kremlin at almost every turn. Although I will say in the last couple of days, I've noticed a slight change in tone from the Trump administration as they see how the momentum has shifted so significantly in Ukraine's favor. So what does this have to do with the Roosevelt and Churchill historical example? If you think about the wars that are out there, Ukraine and Russia, and then with Iran and the United States and Israel and Iran's proxies, and then China is sitting there watching, I think all of these are connected. That if the strategy was based on helping Ukraine defeat Russia first, I'm defeat, not get to a better negotiating position where Russia somehow keeps Crimea or the Donbass or whatever, defeat Russia, then not only have you solved most of Europe's security problems for the next 3 or 4 generations, but also it leaves Iran almost completely isolated. Russia is the only real friend that they have had over the past decades. And so if Russia is totally defeated, then Iran cannot count on any sort of support from Russia. The Chinese, I think, would look at all this and they would say, okay, the West does have the will and the capability and the determination to defeat Russia. And so I think this would serve as an important deterrent to China and whatever it is that China thinks that they're going to do in the future. So the idea of defeat Russia first and having a strategic end state of total defeat of Russia, and Russia's never going to change until they have been defeated. That's usually when they go through some kind of reform, is after they have been defeated. Now, what is happening in Russia and Ukraine right now? What's the status? And I know if some of you, if we've talked before or you've heard me before, I'm an uh, unapologetic advocate for Ukraine. I have been inspired by the what the people have done, what their soldiers have accomplished, even though Russia has had every advantage and the West has not lived up to its obligation to help Ukraine, because I think maybe we didn't appreciate why this mattered for us. But it's important to remember that this war started almost 12 years ago in 2014, not in 22, 2014. And it's important to always keep in mind when it started, because that means for 12 years, Russia has been trying to defeat Ukraine, destroy the idea of Ukraine as a state, and obviously to destroy the Ukrainian government. And after 12 years, with every advantage, they still only control about 20, 21% of Ukrainian territory. And I think their losses that they've suffered by now are well documented. And this is not coming from Ukrainian intelligence or Ukrainian government, but typically British intelligence is who I use for information. So I have a lot of confidence in what I see about this. And now for 5 months in a row, Russia is losing more casualties than they are able to bring in as replacements. That's a trend. That's trending in the wrong direction in a war, in what is turning into a war of attrition. I think the Ukrainians have figured out how to stop Russian ground forces. And by the way, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of challenges on the Ukrainian side. The Russians are still killing innocent Ukrainian civilians every night with hundreds of drone strikes and missiles hitting Ukrainian towns and cities. And the Ukrainians are still not able to stop that. But what they have done is stopped any hope of Russia actually winning this war, and Russia's ability to take Ukrainian territory is almost at a standstill. And they've done this, I think, through innovative use of technologies with which most of you are already familiar by now. You never hear about Ukrainian artillery problems anymore. I mean, it just doesn't seem to be a problem. And I think it's partly because they produce thousands of FPV drones that have replaced artillery as the big killer on the battlefield. And that's what they're using to inflict so many of these casualties. But they also have, the Ukrainian defense industry has grown so much in their capacity and their ability to produce ammunition and other things. I think that's why this has been removed as a major problem for them. By the way, I live here in Frankfurt, so I'm always reminded that the Germans were able to, they reached their peak of aircraft production in late 1944, which, if you think about it, that's after 2 years of intensive bombing by the U.S. Army Air Force, Army Air Corps, and the Royal Air Force. Intensive bombing. And yet the Germans increased production of aircraft during that time. The only thing they couldn't increase production of course, was pilots. And so the point is, I think that despite Russia's best efforts to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure and their morale, Ukraine has actually grown their defense industry. And I think probably 10 years from now, Ukraine is going to be the heart of Europe's defense industry. Frankly, which is what it was during the time of the Soviet Union. It was the heart of the Soviet defense industry as well. The last thing I'd say about on Ukraine and Russia is it seems to me that they have discovered or they have developed a theory of victory that is based on the destruction of Russia's oil and gas export capability. I mean, almost every week you can count on seeing a video of a major refinery on fire. And of course, they're not just hitting the storage tanks, which, that's bad enough, but that doesn't really have real significant effect. What they're doing, they're targeting the parts of the refineries that are the most difficult to replace and repair and will knock the refineries out for an extended period of time. And so I think that this shows a level of targeting, skill, and of course, to have weapons now with enough of a payload like Flamingo or some other drones that can carry a payload over 1,000 kilometers to hit a refinery with precision. That's really something. And then, of course, you probably saw just the other day, they have also hit a couple of Russian shadow fleet vessels out in the Black Sea with unmanned maritime drones over 100 miles from the Black Sea coast. Again, this is significant development and capability when you can have a drone, basically a maritime drone with a big enough payload 100 miles from shore that can disable a major tanker. And what they, of course, the Ukrainians know that what the Russians do, they use these end-of-life vessels to take the oil out of Russia, and then they transload it to a more seaworthy vessel somewhere either in the Black Sea or in the Aegean or outside the Baltic Sea. So the Ukrainians not only are destroying the infrastructure in Russia, but they're also going after the shadow fleet vessels. And I'm not going to put a time on this because I've been wrong so many times before on my predictions on when something might happen. But it's hard to imagine that Russia can continue the conflict if it's not able to export oil and gas in sufficient quantities to China, India, Turkey, or other countries. So I think the combination of stopping the ground assaults and destroying Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, that seems to me to be the theory of victory that the Ukrainians have developed. They still have challenges with defending their cities. They still have challenges with manpower, although you don't hear about that as much as they did before because of what they're doing with drones, they've been able to reduce the number of troops that they have on the front line. So they're not suffering the same kind of casualties that the Russians are. Now, let's and I welcome challenges or questions on any of those things. This is what you're hearing is me thinking through what's happening and how and what does Ukraine need from the rest of us. And I do tell my European friends, I said, it's good to see that almost everybody in Europe is increasing defense spending as they should have done a long time ago. Especially Germany is leading the way in Europe now. But the best way to ensure there is no Russian attack against another European country is to help Ukraine win. That's the best investment that any country can make. Let's switch briefly now to this other part of this interconnected global conflict. Of course, I'm talking about Iran. I imagine that most of you are as confused as I am about exactly what is happening. I mean, it's very difficult to know. And I'll be candid. Part of this is because I don't think anybody believes what the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Higgs, says, and even the president also speaks in a way that is difficult to have confidence in the facts or what's actually going on. But nonetheless, where we are, it seems that the American president is very, very anxious to get out of this conflict as quickly as he can. He'd like to be able to declare victory and then walk away from it. The Iranians, on the other hand, are acting in a way that tells me they think they have more time, that time is on their side, and that that means they think they've got whatever public unrest might be simmering in Iran, that they've got that under control. And while the U.S. Navy and Air Force have clearly destroyed almost all of the assets of the Iranian Navy and the Iranian Air Force, and certainly they have destroyed a lot of Iran's missile launching capabilities and other weapons, it's obvious that the Iranians still have a lot of capability. They demonstrated that the other day with their strikes on the UAE. And when we talk about clearly defined strategic objectives, there is no connection between how many Iranian Navy vessels have been destroyed and the actual strategic situation. Those are irrelevant. It's happy. And by the way, I'm 68 years old, so I was a cadet in 1979 at West Point when the Iranians seized the American embassy there. So for my entire adult professional life, Iran has been the enemy of my country. I wish them nothing good. Uh, but I also care about the men and women of U.S. Armed Forces that are deployed here, and I don't want to see any of them injured or killed for something that's not being properly planned and executed. And what the administration never did do was clearly identify the strategic objective for Iran. We heard a lot of different things. It started off with, we want to protect the protesters. And then the president encouraged the protesters to come out into the streets and take over their government. Then we heard about we want to make sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon and that there's an imminent threat, even though just a few months before the administration had claimed that it had obliterated Iran's nuclear weapons production capability. And then we heard about regime change, want to make sure they can't support Hezbollah or Houthis or Hamas. And so here we are today, after several weeks of combat operations. The administration has decided that the war is over, that Operation Epic Fury is ended, and this Project Freedom, it's interesting that they use the word project, not Operation Freedom, but Project Freedom, because that's part of what I consider the sleight of hand, that they don't have to go back to the Congress and in accordance with the War Powers Act to report and get congressional approval to continue the fighting. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what actually the status is. Now, I spoke or exchanged notes with a young friend who is deployed. He's part of the organization that was implementing the project, or the Red, White, Blue Dome, which is this combination of drones, artificial intelligence, fixed wing aircraft, rotary wing aircraft, other sensors to create what we call the unblinking eye, to get total surveillance of everything that's going on in the Strait of Hormuz, and then having the ability to strike if somebody was going to interfere with it. So this was kind of the structure that was going to make Project Freedom work. And he told me that actually in the first few hours, there were several vessels that were able to get out along the designated path. But then the president turned it off the same day. It's not clear to me why he turned it off. There's some speculation that it was because the Iranians demonstrated they were not just going to sit there in the bleachers on the sideline and allow their only leverage to slip away. So several weapons were launched against U.S. Navy ships, against other vessels, and against the UAE. So perhaps the president decided to stop this because he did not want to run the risk of a U.S. Navy vessel being hit, or maybe a larger tanker being hit. Instead, what he said was, it looks like we're even closer to getting a negotiated outcome, and so I'm pausing Project Freedom. Now, of course, if you take your eye off the news for even an hour, you're immediately way behind on what the developments are. But what I saw today was that, or just a couple of hours ago, it looks like there's some famous memorandum out there that is being considered as a way to, quote, end the war, which they said was already over, um, and that the nuclear issue will be discussed later. And so this appears to be potentially, I don't know this, of course, this appears to potentially be the exit strategy for the administration. They can say, look, the Iranians have agreed to do this. They're going to open the strait, and we won, and we'll sort out the nuclear things later. So I don't intend for this to be just bash the administration. What I'm trying to illustrate is the importance of a clearly defined strategic objective. And then you organize to achieve that objective. And what are the two or three things that you need if you're trying to achieve something of this scale? Well, first of all, you have to have allies. The United States, with the biggest defense budget in history, a fantastic Air Force and Navy, uh, so much quality and technology is not enough to protect all of our interests in Europe, in the Middle East, in South America, and in the Indo-Pacific region. We've never had enough. We have always needed allies, and we've always needed bases and access. Um, the administration, I think, and I'm having to read into what we've seen and heard. I think the administration really believed that if they were able to achieve a catastrophic decapitation strike against the Iranian leadership, that would be it. That the Iranians would collapse, the people would rise up. And I mean, we've all watched and cheered for Iranians over the past few years who looked like they finally were going to overthrow the regime, only to be smashed by the IRGC. But I think they really believe that if they could decapitate the leadership, the supreme leader, that would finally be the catalyst to get it done. Something as quick as what happened in Venezuela. Um, and I tell you, all credit to the Israeli Defense Force and to the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy and our intelligence professionals, what they were able to accomplish. I mean, that was the ultimate catastrophic decapitation strike. The problem is, I think what we have learned in hindsight is that the supreme leader was not actually the supreme power. I think it's the IRGC was the real power there. The leadership of the Islamic Republican Revolutionary Guards Corps, that's the real power. And I believe, as some others have speculated, that they have anticipated this day coming for years, that they knew eventually some American president would eventually strike. And so they were organized to survive in a decentralized way. I mean, you have to marvel in the first 24 hours after the Ayatollah was killed and all of his closest friends were killed, Iranians are launching strikes against every country in the region. I mean, that was impressive. So that told me that they had already thought through the possibility and what their reaction would be, which would be to draw in as many people as possible and make it as difficult as possible for the United States and Israel to um, take over in the region to accomplish its objective. And so here we are today, and I have to tell you, I feel very uncomfortable speaking like this as an American and as a retired Army officer, being so critical of my own government. Um, but here we are today on May the 6th. Iranians still control what goes through the strait by and large, even though they don't have much of a navy anymore, but they're able to do it because insurance companies and shipping companies are not yet willing to send vessels through the strait. They still seem to have control of the 500 kilograms of enriched uranium. You still have the same regime, just with different names, and it appears that the IRGC, what's there now, is actually even more hardline than their predecessors. Um, and you still have Iranian people are suppressed. So the strategic objectives have not been accomplished. But yet today, gas in the United States, as some of you will know better than me, is up over $4.50 a gallon. That's pretty significant. Now, some Europeans would be thrilled to have gas that was only $4.50 a gallon, but in the United States, you know what that means in terms of impact on inflation. That's a dramatic um, threshold. Okay, so let me kind of bring this to a close by going back to the original point of organizing for victory. Clearly defined objective, then working with allies, having a network of people that can provide things that you need to achieve a shared objective, not just bases, although obviously bases like what the UK allows us to have, what the Spanish have allowed us to have, what the Germans allowed us to have, what the Greeks allow us to have in Crete, for example. Understanding how alliances work, you don't go do something and then say, hey, by the way, we need you to come clean up this mess we're making right now. That was, in my view, that was the wrong approach. It was not an organized approach to working with allies and then expecting them to help. And of course, it's turned into a terrible relationship situation now with many of our closest allies, including here with the Germans where I live. The third part that's missing on this, when I go back to the example of Churchill and Roosevelt and what they did in 42 and 43, communicating to the American people. Right now, most of the communication that comes out of the White House and from the Secretary of Defense is in a very partisan Fox News kind of way, as opposed to speaking to all Americans, explaining why we're doing what we're doing. It has a very partisan feel. And so when the Secretary of Defense tells journalists, if you're not supporting the war, you're a traitor. I mean, that's not exactly the America that I think many of us grew up in. But that's how they're communicating. And then the final part of this is on the industry side. Of course, I work with several different companies on the defense industry side, European as well as American. They could all do more. I think they should be willing to share some of the risk, not sit back and wait for a gigantic contract, but also to lean forward. And this is where I will give credit to the Trump administration. They're changing how the Department of Defense and industry work, where instead of companies waiting for a full contract where the government pays for everything, the burden is being shifted now to where companies have to take some of the key steps, take some of the risk up front, and then can be paid later. And I think that's the right approach. And companies know that, and the department has said, hey, look, just because your name is Lockheed or L3 Harris or Raytheon or Boeing doesn't mean you're going to get the contract. They're going to look for people who delivers on budget and on time. And that's changing the dynamic. I think that's an important part of how we organize for victory. Clearly, it's all over the news how much ammunition has been expended, both in terms of air and missile defense as well as long-range precision weapons. And my guess is that the Chinese are sitting there and they're ticking off every time we fire a Tomahawk, every time we fire a Patriot, every time we fire a THAAD, anything like that. They're keeping track of that. And I think that goes into their calculations as well. All right, I think I'm at about the 35-minute mark here. Michael, if it's okay with you and everybody, I'll pause and look forward to challenges and questions and help me get this right.